She is 70 years old. I need you to understand that before I tell you anything else. 70 years old, in an era when most people did not live past 40. She has survived plagues, wars, assassinations, the murders of nearly everyone she loved. She has ruled kingdoms. She has commanded armies. She has outlived every single one of her enemies, except one. And now she is naked, stripped completely bare in front of a jeering crowd of thousands. Soldiers, peasants, nobles, priests, all of them watching, all of them laughing, all of them looking at this 70-year-old woman's body while she stands in chains, waiting to find out how she is going to die. The year is 613. The place is a field outside the city of Renève, in what is now eastern France. And the woman standing naked in that field is Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, one of the most powerful rulers in European history, a woman who shaped the politics of an entire continent for nearly half a century. What they are about to do to her will take 3 days. 3 days of systematic humiliation designed not just to kill her, but to destroy everything she represented. 3 days that the chroniclers of the time recorded in detail because they wanted future generations to know what happens to women who accumulate too much power. 3 days that I am going to tell you about right now, because what happened to Brunhilde reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature that we still have not reckoned with. But here is what I need you to understand first. Brunhilde was not a villain. She was not a monster. The crimes she was accused of, the murders and conspiracies and dark deeds that her enemies attributed to her, most of them were invented after her death to justify what was done to her. The real story is far more complicated, far more tragic, and far more relevant to our world today than you might expect. Because what happened to Brunhilde was not justice. It was revenge. It was the final act in a blood feud that had consumed 2 families for 46 years. It was what happens when powerful men decide that a powerful woman has lived too long and accumulated too much influence and needs to be made an example of. And the way they chose to make that example is something I have never been able to forget since I first learned about it. Stay with me, because I am going to tell you the whole story, not just what they did to her at the end, but how she got there, who she was, what she built, what she lost, and why her final hours were designed to be the most degrading public spectacle that anyone in 6th century Europe had ever witnessed. This is the story of Queen Brunhilde, and I promise you, once you know what I am about to tell you, you will never forget her either. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand what happened to Brunhilde at the end without understanding who she was at the start. She was born around 543 in the Visigothic kingdom, which covered most of what is now Spain and southern France. Her father was King Athanagild, which made her a princess from birth. But being a princess in the 6th century did not mean fairy tales and ball gowns. It meant you were a political asset to be married off to whoever would bring your family the most advantage. When Brunhilde was about 23 years old, her father arranged her marriage to Sigebert I, King of Austrasia. Austrasia was one of the Frankish kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire, covering roughly what is now northeastern France, Belgium, and western Germany. It was a wealthy kingdom, a powerful kingdom, and Sigebert was considered a good match. But here is the first thing you need to understand about Brunhilde. She was not just beautiful, she was brilliant. The chronicles describe her as exceptionally educated, fluent in multiple languages, deeply versed in Roman law and administration. At a time when most royalty could barely read, Brunhilde was a scholar, and she was about to enter a world that had no idea what to do with a woman like her. She married Sigebert in 567. By all accounts, it was a genuine love match, not just a political arrangement. Sigebert was reportedly captivated by her intelligence and her beauty. They had children together. They ruled together. For a brief moment, Brunhilde had everything, and then her sister was murdered. Brunhilde's younger sister, Galswintha, had been married to Sigebert's brother, King Chilperic of Neustria. It was supposed to be another advantageous match, another alliance between kingdoms. But Chilperic had a mistress, a former servant named Fredegund, and Fredegund did not appreciate being set aside for a foreign princess. Within a year of the wedding, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Everyone knew who was responsible. Fredegund made no real effort to hide her involvement, and Chilperic, rather than punishing his mistress, married her, made her his queen, rewarded her for murdering Brunhilde's sister. I want you to imagine what that felt like. Your baby sister, sent to a foreign kingdom to marry a man who turned out to be a monster, murdered in her own bed by a servant who wanted her position. And the man responsible not only faced no consequences, but elevated the murderer to royalty. This is where the blood feud began. This is the wound that would never heal. For the next 46 years, Brunhilde and Fredegund would be locked in a war that would consume their families, their kingdoms, and ultimately their lives. And I need to tell you something about Fredegund before we go any further, because understanding her is essential to understanding what eventually happened to Brunhilde. Fredegund was everything Brunhilde was not. Where Brunhilde was educated and noble-born, Fredegund had risen from nothing through manipulation, seduction, and murder. Where Brunhilde operated through law and administration, Fredegund operated through poison and assassination. The chronicles of the time describe Fredegund as perhaps the most ruthless woman in Frankish history, responsible for ordering the deaths of bishops, nobles, and even members of her own family when they became inconvenient. These two women hated each other with an intensity that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. This was not a political rivalry. This was personal. This was blood, demanding blood. And for nearly 5 decades, that hatred would shape the destiny of Western Europe. But here is what I need you to understand. When the chroniclers wrote about these events, they were almost all men. Men who served the kings, who eventually won. Men who had every reason to portray Brunhilde as a villain and Fredegund as merely a loyal wife defending her husband. The narrative that has come down to us is a narrative written by the people who destroyed Brunhilde, and we need to read it with that understanding. Because the Brunhilde who emerges from the more neutral sources, the administrative records and the legal documents and the building inscriptions, is very different from the monster her enemies described. That Brunhilde was a builder, a reformer, a ruler who maintained Roman roads and aqueducts, who patronized churches and monasteries, who tried to bring order and civilization to kingdoms that were sliding into chaos. That Brunhilde was a woman who did what she had to do to survive in a world that gave women almost no power, and who used what power she had to accomplish things that men would be celebrated for. But that is not the Brunhilde that history chose to remember. History chose to remember the version her enemies created. And what they did to her at the end was designed to make sure that their version would be the only one anyone would ever know. The wars between Brunhilde and Fredegund lasted for decades. Battles were fought. Territories changed hands. Children and grandchildren were drawn into a conflict that had started before most of them were born. Brunhilde's husband, Sigebert, was assassinated in 575, murdered by agents sent by Fredegund. Brunhilde was captured briefly but managed to escape. She remarried, was widowed again, and eventually became regent for her son Childebert II. This is where Brunhilde showed what she was truly capable of. As regent, she did not simply hold power until her son came of age. She wielded it. She formed alliances. She reformed the administration of her kingdom. She built infrastructure. She maintained the postal system that the Romans had created. She patronized the church and used it to extend her influence. She did everything that a king would have done, and in many cases did it better. The problem was that she was not a king. She was a queen. and queen regents were supposed to step aside when their sons grew up. Brunhilde did not step aside. Even after Childebert came of age, even after he married and had children of his own, Brunhilde remained the dominant force in Austrasian politics. When Childebert died in 596, Brunhilde became regent again, this time for her grandsons Theudebert and Theuderic, 2 kings now, 2 kingdoms, and 1 grandmother controlling both. This was unprecedented. This was dangerous. And this was when the nobility of Austrasia and Burgundy began to truly fear her. You have to understand, the Frankish nobility had power because the kings were weak. They had carved out their own territories, their own privileges, their own semi-independent domains. A strong king threatened all of that. And Brunhilde was not just a strong king, she was an intelligent one who understood Roman law and administration, one who might actually succeed in centralizing power in ways that would destroy their autonomy forever. They could not simply depose her. She had the loyalty of the church. She had the loyalty of much of the common people. She had decades of experience and a network of alliances that made her dangerous to challenge directly. So they waited. They plotted. They spread rumors about her. They whispered that she was responsible for every death, every misfortune, every setback that befell the kingdom. They called her a witch. They called her a murderer. They called her things that I cannot repeat here, but that you can imagine. And they waited for their opportunity. Meanwhile, Fredegund died. In 597, Brunhilde's great enemy finally passed away, apparently of natural causes. After 46 years of war, Brunhilde had outlived her. But Fredegund had a son, Clothar II, and he had inherited not just his mother's kingdom, but her hatred. The blood feud was not over. It had simply passed to the next generation. Clothar was patient. He was cunning. And he understood something that Brunhilde perhaps did not fully appreciate. The Austrasian nobility did not just dislike Brunhilde. They feared her. And fear can be turned into action if you offer people the right incentive. In 613, the trap was finally sprung. Brunhilde's own nobles betrayed her. They invited Clothar to invade. They opened their gates to his armies. They handed over their queen, the woman who had ruled them for decades, to her greatest enemy. She was 70 years old. She had survived everything the world had thrown at her. She had outlived husbands, children, grandchildren. She had navigated the most dangerous political landscape in Europe for nearly half a century. And now she was in the hands of a man whose mother she had been at war with for his entire life. A man who had spent years listening to stories about how Brunhilde had murdered his relatives, destroyed his family, brought ruin to his people. A man who wanted revenge not just for himself, but for a mother who had died hating Brunhilde with her final breath. What happened next would become the most notorious execution in early medieval history. I need to prepare you for what I am about to describe, because the details of what was done to Brunhilde are disturbing. They were meant to be disturbing. The entire point was to create a spectacle of suffering so extreme that no woman would ever again dare to accumulate the kind of power that Brunhilde had held. The torture lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Brunhilde was subjected to every humiliation that Clothar and his advisors could devise. And the records are clear that this was not random cruelty. Every element was chosen deliberately to maximize her degradation. On the first day, she was stripped. A 70-year-old woman, a queen who had worn the finest garments in Europe, who had received ambassadors and commanded armies, was stripped naked in front of the assembled crowd. Her clothes were torn from her body, while soldiers held her in place, and then she was made to stand there, exposed, while people looked and pointed and laughed. This was not just cruelty, this was theater. In the 6th century, a queen's body was supposed to be sacred, hidden, covered in rich fabrics that signified her status. To expose that body was to strip away everything she represented, to force people to see her not as a ruler but as just flesh, old flesh, vulnerable flesh. The sources describe her standing with what dignity she could manage, while the crowd jeered. They threw things at her. They shouted insults, and she stood there, because what else could she do? On the second day, she was paraded. They put her on a camel, not a horse, which would have had some dignity, a camel. In Frankish territory, camels were exotic, foreign, associated with the strange peoples of the East. Putting Brunhilde on a camel was a way of saying she was not really one of them. She was other. She was foreign. She was a Visigothic outsider who had presumed to rule Frankish kingdoms for 50 years. They led the camel through crowds of people, through villages and towns, through places where Brunhilde had once been greeted with ceremony and reverence. Now she was paraded as a captured enemy, still naked, still exposed, mounted on an animal that made her look ridiculous. The chronicles describe people coming from miles around to see the spectacle, to see the great queen brought low, to see this woman who had terrified their lords reduced to a naked old woman on a camel. And through all of this, she was alive. She was conscious. She knew what was happening. She felt every moment of it. I cannot imagine what those 2 days were like for her. The physical suffering would have been immense. No food or little food. No water or little water. Exposed to the elements. 70 years old and subjected to treatment that would break a young person in peak health. But the psychological suffering must have been worse. Every face in those crowds was someone who knew who she was. Many of them had served her. Many of them had benefited from her rule. And now they were laughing at her naked body, throwing garbage at her, shouting obscenities. Everything she had built, everything she had accomplished, everything she had survived, none of it mattered now. She was just a spectacle, an object lesson, a warning, and she still had one more day to endure. On the third day, they killed her. But not quickly, not mercifully. The execution method that Clothar chose was designed to ensure that Brunhilde's death would be as prolonged and as painful and as degrading as her life's final days had been. They tied her to a horse, not placed her on a horse, tied her to one. The accounts differ on exactly how this was done. Some say her hair was tied to the horse's tail. Some say her arms and legs were bound to 4 different horses. The most common account says that she was tied by one arm, one leg, and her hair to the tail of a wild horse. And then they released the horse. I am not going to describe what happened next in detail, because you can imagine it. A wild horse, terrified, bolting across a field, dragging a 70-year-old woman behind it. The impact, the tearing, the gradual destruction of a human body as it was pulled across rough ground at speed. The sources say it took time. They say she did not die immediately. They say the horse ran and ran while Brunhilde was still alive, still conscious, still feeling everything. And then, when it was finally over, when the horse had tired and Brunhilde's body was no longer recognizable as human, they burned what was left. There would be no tomb for Brunhilde, no monument, no place where people could come to remember her. The message was clear. This woman was to be erased, not just killed, but obliterated, removed from existence so thoroughly that nothing would remain except the memory of her suffering. That was the point. The suffering was the message. Every element of her execution, from the stripping to the camel to the horse, was designed to ensure that her death would be remembered for centuries. That women who might be tempted to accumulate power would remember what happened to women who overreached. That the lesson would be carved into history so deeply that it could never be forgotten. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Brunhilde was remembered primarily as a cautionary tale. the wicked queen who got what she deserved, the woman who murdered kings and was righteously punished by a just ruler. It is only in recent decades that historians have begun to question this narrative, to look past the propaganda that Clothar's chroniclers created and try to see the real woman behind the legend. What they have found is complicated. Brunhilde was not a saint. She lived in a violent time and did violent things. But she was also not the monster that her enemies portrayed.